Boaz and Daphne have talked about the application of the proportionality principle of IHL to COIN, which obviously presupposes that IHL is the appropriate legal framework to regulate COIN. And this is not as clear as some people might think. There is a growing movement in the international legal community that argues that human rights law is the appropriate legal framework to regulate counterinsurgency operations. And I want to argue or explain to you why it's my belief that that's a flawed application of law, particularly in the relation of the application of combat power. That in fact, Daphne and Boaz are on point when they suggest that the real challenge in COIN is the application of the IHL principle of proportionality and not the human rights principle of proportionality. And they are two different principles. If human rights law is the regulatory framework for counterinsurgency operations, or what I'm going to call NIAC, non-international armed conflict, because in my view, counterinsurgency is non-international armed conflict. If human rights law is the appropriate or the dominant regulatory framework, then we would be asking whether the attack on the enemy insurgent forces themselves is a proportional application of force. Should we have to arrest them instead of kill them? Should we have to wound instead of kill? In other words, should we ask our armed forces to function as law enforcement agents for the state in the context of the struggle against an armed belligerent group? Only if we're in the IHL framework, only then does our proportionality focus shift to the innocent or collateral consequences of a lawful attack on an enemy combatant. And I think both Boaz and Daphne started with the assumption that the primary objective, the purposeful objective of your attack, is a lawful enemy target. Right? And in IHL, the proportionality rule presupposes that you've identified a lawful object of attack as a predicate matter. And then you're only worried about the knowing but non-purposeful consequences to the civilian population. But the difficulty here is the term that Boaz used in his chart, the term combatant. International humanitarian law limits the definition of combatant by treaty law to individuals fighting on behalf of the state, individuals engaged in what Daphne called a common Article II international armed conflict. And yet we know that international humanitarian law has evolved since 1949 to establish a regulatory framework for what the international lawyers call NIAC, non-international armed conflict, an armed conflict between state forces and non-state organized belligerent groups. Now the origins of NIAC was war. Let's be clear. The primary impetus for Common Article III of the four Geneva Conventions, which is the first positive or treaty-based treatment of this different type of armed conflict, this armed conflict between state forces and non-state forces, was the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939. And anybody who, all you have to do is read For Whom the Bell Tolls, and you know that that was a real war. Okay, soldiers involved in that war were probably not too concerned whether it was international or non-international. There were huge organized belligerent forces on either side, following traditional military organization, conducting traditional military operations with trench lines and battle fronts and tanks and bombing and everything else. That's the origin of NIAC. My view is that reveals to us that NIAC has always been premised on the assumption that it's a struggle between state armed forces and organized enemy belligerent groups. Of course, the experience of Israel and the United States following 9/11 has challenged this area of law significantly, because unlike the kind of Spanish Civil War model, or maybe even the insurgencies of the 1970s and 80s that led to the development of Additional Protocol 2, where you have an organized insurgent group within a state challenging the warrant of the government, challenging the authority of the government, trying to take over the government. Unlike that model, you have a transnational, loosely organized terrorist organization that's engaged in belligerent activity against the state. And so that's created a tremendous amount of uncertainty.